Hello and welcome again. It's Liz here again, and we're now going to make our way through Module C of MBA 5007. And in this module, what we're going to be talking about is a number of different analytical models and frameworks that can be used to help us actually understand markets and competition and so forth. So let's have a look at the objectives for this module. At the end of this module, we should be able to understand the major avenues for achieving competitive advantage based on lower costs and or differentiating a company's products or services from the offerings of competitors and other rivals. We're going to identify the attributes of a best cost strategy, a hybrid low cost provider, and also differentiation strategies. Then we're going to have a look at another couple of concepts known as first mover or last follower or late mover, and we're going to see how they might be advantageous to an organisation trying to make its mark in the market. We're also going to have a look at the strategic benefits and risks of expanding an organisation either through horizontal mergers and acquisitions or even through partnerships. We're also going to have a look at the advantages and the disadvantages of extending the scope of the operations of an organisation through, organic means as opposed to vertical integration. And then finally in this module, we're going to look at the conditions that favour outsourcing certain value chain activities to outside parties. So when is it good to outsource? When is it advantageous? And when is it better to actually do these things in-house? So let's start. And we're going to start again by having a look at another case study. We're going to go back to our company Amazon again. It launched its online bookstore all the way back in 1995. But then, like we mentioned earlier, they soon expanded beyond books to include all types of customer goods. And besides offering customers a big selection of products at low prices, Amazon also provided marketing and promotional services for third-party retailers and web services for developers. So that's how they've expanded their offering, if you like. And in July of 2015, Amazon actually surpassed Walmart in sales to be the biggest company now. And at that point in time, their shares actually increased by 17%, giving Amazon a market value of nearly $263 billion compared to Walmart's capitalization, which was at around $233.5 billion. So you can see quite a significant amount larger. Amazon, like many other successful companies, had a number of competitive weapons in its toolkit, if you like, in its arsenal, to try and drive customer loyalty and to sustain its market position. But even though they had a lot of these tools in their kit bag, they have faced some quite significant challenges which might have threatened their business model if they weren't on the ball. When Amazon started its 22nd year of operations, they had to go back and review their strategy and also their business plan to make sure that they were going to remain a sustainable company, particularly seeing where technology was moving to. And the sort of things that they were moving into were areas where Apple and Google already had a head start, and areas that Facebook also were likely to enter in the near future. So they had quite a few rivals in that area. As we go through the material in this module today, I'd like you to think about a few questions in relation to Amazon, and then we'll come back to the answers to those questions at the conclusion of our module. What I'd like you to think about is this. I'd like you to think about how has Amazon's business model changed as a reaction to the driving forces of change that we learnt about in Module B. I'd like you to think about what the 4 pillars are of Amazon's business model in e-commerce. And finally, I'd like you to think about how Amazon has improved value chain logistics to try and gain a competitive advantage as a low-cost provider of e-commerce. So reflect on those questions as we make our way through the module today. Let's start off by having a look at why strategies differ. A firm's competitive strategy deals exclusively with the specifics of its efforts to position itself in a certain place in the marketplace. It might want to please its customers, it might want to ward off competitive threats, or achieve some other kind of particular competitive advantage. What we have in the diagram here, key factors that distinguish one strategy from the other. And what are those two main factors? First of all, we need to ask, is the firm's market target market broad or is it narrow? Is the competitive advantage pursued linked to either low costs, being a low-cost provider, or to product differentiation, being different to somebody else? We introduced these concepts, these different cost concepts and differentiation in Module A, but now we're going to look at them in more detail as we look through these 5 generic competitive strategies that are available to organisations. And I'd like you to think about Amazon as we discuss these 5 generic competitive strategies. Okay, so we've got the 5 strategies listed here. Low-cost provider, broad differentiation, focused low cost, focused differentiation, and best cost provider. So let's go through each of these ones now. First of all, what's a low-cost provider? A low-cost provider strives to achieve lower overall costs than their rivals on the products, and that attracts a broad array of buyers. Okay, so the lowest cost to attract the most possible buyers. When we're speaking about broad differentiation, what we're talking about is a strategy which differentiates the firm's products or services that it's offering from those of its rivals. So they've got certain attributes that their other rivals haven't got. Okay, so maybe they're a better quality, or maybe they've got some other unique little thing that other competitors' products haven't. When we have a focused low-cost strategy, what that's all about is concentrating on a very narrow price-sensitive segment of the market. And in that particular segment, we're offering a lower-priced product. Okay, so very narrow. Then we've got the idea of focused differentiation. And what that does is, again, it concentrates on a fairly narrow buyer segment, and it tries to meet the very specific tastes and requirements of a very small niche market. Okay? So not appealing to the masses, but appealing to a small, narrow niche market. And then the final one, best cost provider, that's about giving customers more value for money by offering what we refer to as upscale product attributes at a lower cost than what the rivals are offering something similar at. So here we have another diagram of these 5 generic competitive strategies. So you'll see the first top left is an overall low-cost provider strategy. So here we're trying to appeal to a broad cross-section of the market by providing low-cost products or services. Then we've got the broad differentiation strategy, which, like we said, is just standing out as different, something really different about the products or the services that you're offering. The bottom left is focused low-cost strategy. So here you've got a low-cost strategy, but you're only focusing on a small niche market, not the broad general market. And then focused differentiation is, again, differentiation, but focused at a very narrow niche market. So now we're going to look at a few of these in a little bit more detail. So let's start off by having a look at the low-cost provider strategies. What are some of the effective low-cost approaches that an organisation might use? The reason why this is somewhat useful for organisations is because the fact that if you can actually achieve really good cost savings, these are often very difficult for competitors and rivals to imitate. It takes quite a long time to be able to drive down the costs. So here we're not talking about reducing product quality. What we're talking about is simply similar or the same level of product quality, but at a lower cost. Some of the advantages and risks with this approach are as follows. We can have total greater profits because we're selling more at a lower cost, so that gives us more profit because we've got bigger market share, and that's always an advantage. But sometimes the lower pricing doesn't attract sufficient customers, and if the lower price doesn't attract sufficient customers, then we've got the issue where profitability could actually fall, because the lower cost has to be compensated for by attracting more customers. Rivals' retaliatory price cutting sets off a price war. That's something else that can happen. If one player in a particular market decides to cut their costs to really drive this low cost, then other people can try and undercut them. We had an example of something like this recently in Australia, where we had one of our major supermarkets, I think it must be about 5 or 6 years ago now, introduce the $1 a litre milk. Right? That was a low-cost strategy. And as soon as one retailer, Coles, did that, then the other supermarkets, Woolworths and Aldi, introduced the same thing. And now just this last week or so, we've had the situation where, in fact, the first supermarket that introduced the $1 a litre milk now has decided that that's not a good idea anymore. It's going to put that price up by 10 cents to $1.10 a litre. And now we're waiting to see whether the other two major supermarket chains here are going to follow suit. So far, they haven't. While we're talking about this grocery and supermarket area, Aldi is another interesting example of a low-cost provider strategy. When Aldi came into the Australian market, they deliberately pursued a low-cost strategy. And it wasn't a focused low-cost strategy, but it was a low-cost strategy to appeal to the broader market. And that has shaken up grocery retailing in Australia to quite a large degree, and they're doing very well and have taken away significant shares of the market from our two major players, Coles and Woolworths. Right. Let's have a bit of a look and see how these strategies can actually impact the value chain activities in organisations. When a company tries to manage its value chain's activities, what it does, amongst other things, is it has to analyse its cost drivers. Because remember how we had the core activities and then we had support activities? What we're trying to see, if we're going to pursue a low-cost strategy, is we've got to see where we can take costs out of either our core areas or out of those support strategies. And that's why we try and find out what drives those costs. And that's what we mean by the term cost drivers. A cost driver is simply a factor that has a very big influence on the company's overall costs. In other words, it drives the cost of the company. And sometimes when we're trying to work out what the cost drivers are, these cost drivers can either be asset-based or activity-based. Let's see if I can give you an example. If we've got, I'll just see if I can think of some. If we just look at the grocery store, supermarket, our Coles or our Woolworths, a cost driver there might be the number of customers in the store. The number of customers in the store drives how many people they need on the checkouts. How many people they have on the checkouts drives the firm's costs to an extent. Okay, so that's what we mean by an activity-based cost driver. And to secure a cost advantage, a company might then try and use lower cost inputs and also maybe hold minimal assets. So lower cost inputs might be, maybe instead of hiring people that have been with the company for 20 odd years and have climbed up the pay scale, they might try and employ a lot of part-timers who are perhaps school students who they don't have to pay the same level of wages to. Okay, so they pursue a lower cost input. And holding minimal assets would be something like keeping their holdings of cash to a minimum, because simply holding cash is expensive because you don't get anything for it. You could instead be investing that money and actually making a return on it. Other strategies or other things that organisations do if they're pursuing this low cost strategy is they might only offer essential product features or services, and that's something that Aldi does. If you compare the number of products in a Coles or a Woolworths supermarket with the number of products in an Aldi supermarket, you'll find that the Aldi supermarkets have far fewer of the same type of product. Okay? Like a Coles or a Woolworths might have 10 or 20 different brands of a particular tomato soup, let's say, for example, whereas Aldi might only have a couple. So they offer limited product lines. And they also use low-cost distribution channels. So it's like you pack all your own bags, nobody ever packs your bags for you, you pack your own. Again, it means that the customers can flow through more quickly, and it ties the person who's working on the checkout up for less time. They can be serving somebody else instead of packing a bag. So they're always looking to focus on the most economical delivery mechanisms if they're actually pursuing a true low-cost strategy. I just want to have a look at a couple of different cost concepts at this point in time. A low-cost provider's basis for competitive advantage is simply having the lower overall cost compared to the competitors. If somebody is actually a low-cost leader, that means they have the lowest general costs within the industry as a whole. They're particularly good at finding ways to keep those costs coming down and still provide an acceptable product and level of service to their customer. A cost driver is something that we mentioned before. It's simply a factor that has a strong influence on the customer's costs. Have a think now, back to our company Amazon. What are some of the things, or what might be some of the activity-based cost drivers for Amazon? What type of things might drive Amazon costs? Straight away you might think, well, the amount of goods that it actually has to deliver, its delivery channels, would impact cost. Does it have to air freight all these goods that it sells out? Do they go out by truck? Do they go by boat? How quickly do they have to go out? Do they need to be delivered within 3 days, 5 days, 10 days? What does their strategy say? So that'd be an example of some of the activity-based cost drivers for a company like Amazon that we've been looking at in our case studies today. So cost drivers really are the key to driving down a company costs. So we have to work out what all of these different cost drivers are, and then work out, well, how can we reduce these particular cost drivers? So some of the cost drivers that you'll see mentioned on this slide, things like incentive systems. So incentive systems influence what the costs of a company is. Incentive systems being how much do we pay people? Is it salary? Is it bonus? What is it? Economies of scale. Sometimes the larger a business gets, we can actually gain these economies of scale. The kind of experience that our staff has, that can have an impact. How much we utilise our capacity. If we don't utilise all of our capacity, or if we have equipment and machinery that stays idle for some of the time, that's obviously going to increase our costs. Then there's all sorts of other things like communication systems and information technology, production technology and design. All of those kind of things are cost drivers which will influence the total costs of a company relative to its revenue. So what are some of the methods that a company has available at its disposal to actually cut costs or to reduce costs? Sometimes people, when they hear the word cost cutting, straight away think about, oh, we've got to get rid of staff. But there's lots of other things that organisations can do to cut costs that have got nothing to do with reducing the number of staff they have. For example, up here, the first point says we can capture all available economies of scale. So that's an important one. Take full advantage of experience and learning curve effects. So if somebody's got a lot of experience within your organisation and has got good ideas, use those good ideas, tap into them. They might actually save you some money. Operating facilities at full or near full capacity. So don't have the sort of premises, for example, for your business where half of the premises remains empty. You just don't need something of that size. You're only using half of it. You want to be making sure that your premises are always operating at fairly close to full capacity. Improving your supply chain efficiency. So how quickly and effectively we can get something out from a warehouse to a delivery channel and then out to the end customer, something like that. It all adds up. Substituting lower cost inputs whenever there is little or no sacrifice in product quality or performance. We might have a particular product which comprises several different components. We might be able to source a couple of those components from a different supplier, and then they might be a whole lot less expensive for us. But an important bit there, without sacrificing product quality, because the moment you sacrifice product quality, then in fact your customers will notice the change in the quality and they might not stick around. Using the firm's bargaining power. So if in fact you're in a fairly strong position, you might be able to simply negotiate a better deal with some suppliers. So that's what we mean by using the firm's bargaining power. And the other thing we can try and do is use online systems and technology as much as we possibly can to actually enhance operating efficiencies. And there's a lot of gains to be had out of that kind of approach as well. And a few more over here. Improve process design and employing advanced production technology. Sometimes what you'll see, particularly in manufacturing type organisations that have a lot of plant and equipment, if the plant and equipment isn't maintained well, you'll notice that there's plant and equipment that's breaking down all the time. When it's broken down and remains idle, it's costing the firm money, isn't it? And it's increasing the costs of the organisation instead of driving down costs. So we've got to make sure that our processes are designed in such a way and our technology and everything is working together so that we don't do things like waste time due to breakdowns and things like that. Be alert to the cost advantages of outsourcing or vertical integration. So sometimes it's just better to outsource something to an expert rather than trying to do it yourself because you don't have the particular skills necessarily to do it. And then finally, motivating employees through incentives and company culture. And we've got a couple of interesting case studies on that in a little while as to how that can actually work both to the company's advantage and to the employee's advantage. Okay, so how can we actually become a successful low-cost provider then? Now that we know what a low-cost provider is, how can we be successful at that? First of all, what we need to do is we need to be able to, if you like, outsmart our rivals in finding ways to perform value chain activities more ways to perform. If we can do it more quickly than they do and more accurately than they do, then straight away that drives down the cost. So what that might mean is that the company might need to spend fairly aggressively on resources and other capabilities to enable them to do that. They might need to invest in new technologies, for example, and then that may also help drive down costs. One of the main things is that they have to constantly be reviewing cost-saving resources, because what might work at one point in time may not work a little bit later down the track. So it's this constant review process that needs to go on. So being a low-cost provider, that's just one of those 5 generic strategies that we showed in the opening slide. There's also a few others, and differentiation was one of the other ones. So instead of distinguishing ourselves by doing a low cost, we might differentiate ourselves in another way, and we're going to have a look at that next.